Hello everyone, this is Jason from Primetime Aquatics, and in this video I'm going to show you a tank that quite frankly I would never recommend this mix of fish, but it's an interesting mix. Wanted to give you an update, talk a little bit about the background and why this tank turned out the way it did. Hope you enjoy the video, appreciate you being here. All right, so just what exactly are we looking at here? This is a 75-gallon tank that started out as a Peacock tank that had a mix of fish. It started out with some red empress and some dragon bloods, and they started breeding, and we got all kinds of interesting mixes. You can see some OBs in here. That's actually the result of some of the offspring. So it gave us a lot of interesting fish, and so this was an example of a Peacock 75. There's a couple other things going on in here that you will notice. We have some dwarf petricola, Cynodontis catfish in here. There's probably about 4 or 5. We also have a Cyprichromis species, and I no longer remember the exact species of that fish, but it is from the genus Cyprichromis. That's the larger cylindrical looking fish. And of course, the fish in the tank that is a little bit odd that's standing out is this female Midas cichlid ruby. A little bit of background here. This was not intended to be. She was not intended to be in this tank ever. We had her in another 75 with a male, and they decided to breed, and his name was Roger. Roger passed on after they had lots and lots and lots of fry. In fact, I did a species profile of these fish. If you want to see it, check it out in the upper right hand corner. I will put it in the description below. When I did the species profile on this fish, not in a million years did I ever mention you can keep these fish with African cichlids. It's not something I typically recommend. So how did this happen? Well, after Roger, the male, passed away, we just had her in a 75 with some of her offspring. And what's interesting about these fish is the offspring will pick at the mucus secretions of the Midas cichlids, kind of like discus do, and it was kind of wearing her down. So I had to get her out of that tank. I wanted to break that 75 down, put different fish in. Where are we going to put her? Well, when it comes to mixing African and American cichlids, for the most part, it's hit or miss, and it usually is miss. Unsuccessful more than it can be successful. But with this particular fish, she was fairly non-aggressive but still assertive, and she had a decent amount of size on her. So I figured, why not try her in the Peacock 75 gallon, something I would not do if this was the only tank I had and I didn't have the opportunity to keep moving her to tanks until she found a place where she fit in. The reason why she's in here is I figured this was an established tank. We had a lot of full-grown male and female Peacock cichlids in here, and for the most part, they just interact with each other. They completely ignore her, and she completely ignores them because this was an established tank, and so the mix is working out okay right now. When you're looking at mixing these fish, and again, I did a much more thorough video about whether or not you could mix American or New World and Old World / African cichlids. I'll put that in the upper right-hand corner as well as in the description below, but as I mentioned, this tank was never intended to wind up with this crazy mix of fish. And as you look at this tank, what's interesting to me about it is we've got a lot of female Peacock cichlids in here as well. There are red empress, there's some imbenjis. You can see here there's actually 2 males who are trying to mate. They're not going to be successful. But you can look, when you see the silver fish or the brown fish, those are all the females. And most of them are holding eggs or fry in their mouth because these African peacocks are mouth-brooding cichlids. I often get asked the question, what happens if you have a cichlid that is holding fry in their mouth and you don't want the offspring? My recommendation is just leave them in the community tank if that's indeed the case where they're currently located. And the offspring will most likely be swallowed by the female, or when she spits them out, immediately be consumed by the other fish. You probably won't see any. We actually have one of the smaller, you can see one of the smaller, what appears to be a red empress female kind of in there that survived. Sometimes we'll pull the females out and put them in a separate tank so they can release their fry, and that works out pretty well. And again, we get some really cool mixes. The OBs that you're seeing, that is a result of red empress males with dragon blood females or vice versa, and we get some of these really cool fish. So this has worked out so far. And it's mostly because, again, you have to understand the temperament of the fish, both in this case, the Midas female and the other types of cichlids. You can see here, one of the really interesting things, and one of the things that you should notice when you're going to a pet store or someone's house and they say, hey, this mix of fish has worked out really well. What you should be looking for are a couple things. One, are any of the fish constantly hiding in corners or behind rocks and wood? And you don't see that happening here. And the second thing that you should be noticing is what are the condition of the fish themselves. So do we have a lot of fin nipping going on? Are their fins torn apart? Are they in bad shape, physically? And again, that's just not something that we see here in this tank. This could change at any moment. In fact, in our 125, we had a large, it was actually Roger's brother, we had a large Midas cichlid in that tank, and it worked out for many months. And then one day, the Midas cichlid decided that he was going to begin running the tank, and he pushed the Oscar into the corner of the tank, and he even started to pick on our 18-inch tilapia in that tank. So that was an instance where it was working fine. But because he was a more aggressive male, as he grew in size, he tried to establish his dominance, and that didn't work out long term, so he had to be removed. And in fact, we moved him on to a friend of ours who had many of those types of cichlids and got into a much better situation. And so as you begin to look at your mixes of fish, I think the lesson that we want to learn is, one, we really want to be careful from the start and do our research, especially when we have limited tanks. Now, for us, it's so much easier to move fish around because we've got 83 tanks up and running. If something doesn't work, it's a very easy thing to do, and that is move fish to other environments until we find a mix that works. But for people who don't have quite as many tanks, this is not something I typically recommend, where we're mixing these African cichlids with the larger South and Central American cichlids, because one, we don't know how aggressive they're going to wind up being for their own personality. But usually, some of these larger Central and South American cichlids do get more aggressive as they age. And so even if something works out early on, they will become often far more assertive. The other thing that you have to look at, of course, and I think one of the most important things, is diet, something that we talk about in the other video. Just so happens with this mix of fish, the diet is relatively similar. We throw in some North Fin flakes and some pellets and some North Fin food sticks, and they all eat it and they're all happy. If these were Mbuna cichlids, this would not work out. The diets would just be too different. And of course, the water parameters, we really don't make an effort to change our water parameters in any of our tanks. So they've all got the same pH, they've all got the same water hardness. So that's not really an issue there. And so it's working out okay. So some of the things I'm keeping an eye on as we move forward, and that is, if I see any aggression in either direction, either her being the aggressor for the other fish starting to gang up on her, we will make yet more changes. In fact, I've got another situation in the 125. We actually had about 30 or 40 Midas cichlid fry from this fish in the 125. We pulled them all out. I sold them to a friend of mine who could distribute them down south in our state. And we missed one. And now there is obviously it's obvious to me, there's a male in that tank with a nuchal hump that is beginning to grow. And so now I'm going to have to keep a very close eye on that, because it wasn't supposed to be in that tank. And if we have problems, we're going to have to move it right away. So I wanted to pass this tank along to you. Sometimes we'll get questions about lighting. That's a Phoenix, 48-inch Phoenix light. We've only got the 2 sponge filters. And so a lot of times people ask, are sponge filters sufficient for your tank? Absolutely. Look at the stocking level. Yes, I know we're going to get comments. This tank is overstocked. Well, if you want to keep Peacock cichlids happy and reduce the aggression, again, I think the results speak for themselves. We've got a tank where the fish are relatively calm. There's not a lot of aggression, even between the Midas cichlid and the Peacocks. Yeah, could the sponge filters do a better job of mechanical filtration? Well, they can't. It would be nice to have more mechanical filtration in that tank, but at least in terms of biological filtration, no ammonia, no nitrite, just the 2 sponge filters, and it's working out pretty well. So I wanted to bring you this tank. I hope you enjoyed it. Would love to hear from you. Have you tried to mix these cichlids before, and what kind of success did you have long term? I appreciate you watching, and we'll see you in the next one.